I keep thinking you'll come on back to me. You'll come on back to
In the race to provide more content for our audiences, we've created a systematic web of back-end digital clutter. Fret not, this can be fixed. Organizations can clean up the back of their houses and offer richer content experiences for their audiences. It's time to learn how. He's got actionable plans and best practices. Please welcome Matt Grocki.
I keep thinking.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming so much. This is my first time to Sioux Falls, and I'm super excited to be here. I'm very thankful to the Now What organizers and to Blend for inviting me to speak. Great lineup today. I'm so psyched to see so many old colleagues and friends today, and I can't wait to hear some more stories. And also, before we dive in, if we don't get a chance to answer any questions during today's session, by all means, we're headed straight to lunch after this. So. And I'm totally going to have some lunch, so let's continue the conversation there if you'd like to as well. So, as I mentioned, my name is Matthew Grocki. You may see on the program, I'm the owner and operator of Grass-Fed Content, but most recently I've started a new initiative called First Chair Partners, which along with my two co-founders, Lynn Polishuk and Justin Davis, have created a consultancy. It's a user experience, research design, user research, and product design consultancy, as well as content strategy. So if you want any more information on that, by all means, let me know. So before we dive in today, raise your hands if you take pictures with your phone. Everyone takes pictures with their phone, right? Keep your hands raised if you feel like every single picture in your phone is neatly organized and you know exactly where you need it at all times. Right, like we're gonna talk about that today. And we're going to talk about how that impacts what we do, both in the organizations that we serve and our own individual digital practices, if you will. So first off, there's kind of three main parts to what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about how our personal behavior patterns affect the content that we produce and manage. We'll be talking about how those organizations and the organizational culture affects the content that's produced within their own ecosystems, and how in the balance in the way that the folks interact both from an organizational level, and then how that really affects the audiences that we're looking to serve. And then thirdly, we'll kind of map out some effective practices, some strategies, some takeaway items that you guys can use as practitioners in order to say, okay, like I understand that we're dealing with an abundance of content, an abundance of information that's really affecting the digital experiences that we're trying to provide for our users, and what are the things that I can do? What are the things that I can do as a content professional, as a marketer, as a user experience expert? One of the things to think about today as we talk about a lot of these systems is this grows at scale. And I think when we start to talk about the work that we do, it's always like, oh, well, Matt just showed us that example, but that's not really what I'm working on. And so the challenge today is to take some of the examples and the working examples that I'll be showing you, and to try to articulate that into your own experiences. And again, if you have any follow-up questions on that, and on, I get a lot of feedback when I give this talk, which is like, Matt, I hear what you're saying, but this is the core problem that I have, and how would this, your solution translate into my organization or the project that I'm working on? And again, great sidebar conversation I'd love to follow up and have a conversation with you about. So in order for me, when I'm designing and working with and creating content for digital experiences, I like to think, I use, the oft-used, back of the house, front of the house mentality. Totally fitting that we're here in a theater on stage, and I can kind of tie that in beautifully. But one of the things that we're so concerned with oftentimes is our audience, and rightly so. We're trying to create experiences that drive audience engagement. We're trying to reach our audience. We're trying to lead with language that speaks to them and not necessarily leads with our corporate initiative, right? So we're very focused right here on the front of the house. And what I want to talk about today is really the back of the house mentality. What are we doing on the back end? Because in the rush to create these amazing digital experiences, we're oftentimes forgetting what's going on in the back of the house, and we're underserving our internal customer. And so I see this time and time again, both in small organizations, small agencies, all the way up to large enterprises where, I'll ask them, why are there 5 different product descriptions for one product that you have? And they'll respond, well, the marketing department wrote that over here, and the sales department wrote the product description over here. And you know what? Honestly, I went to go look for a product description. I couldn't find it, so I just wrote my own. And so how we're, underserving the back of the house is really affecting the experiences that we look to design throughout the day. And, one of the things that I think we need to be cognizant of before we kind of dive into this discussion a little bit is just how new this all is. If we look at individual behaviors, we're talking about over thousands of years that it's taken in order to, get to where we are. Organizations a little bit younger, hundreds of years in which, organizational behavior has been a topic that's been often discussed, and there's been a maturation of it. But when we look at individuals and individual digital behaviors and organizational digital behaviors, we're still very much at the infancy of this. We're literally years, maybe dozens of years in the making as far as dealing with all this digital content that we have to sift through and provide for our audiences. So let's cut ourselves a small break before beating ourselves up about how much content that we have to deal with and trying to figure out how to deal with that content. So today's talk will center around 4 main points. It's very simple. In fact, anytime I bullet something out, I don't think I use any more than 3 or 4 bullets. So, we're going to talk about our personal behaviors, how that affects the content and the design systems that we create. We're going to talk about the organizational behaviors of your own organization. I'll talk about some examples of organizational behavior and how that's affecting the content that we have to deal with. We'll talk about, some organization, and specifically one use case organization that's doing the right thing about dealing with an abundance of content and how they're able to, how they've been able to reduce the number of content pages to better serve their audience. And then specifically, we'll talk about what you guys can do as professionals, and whether you're a marketing professional, content professional, user experience, and anywhere in between. All right. So when we look at personal behaviors, I'd like to start with a story. This is one of my favorite stories because it involves my kids, and who doesn't love talking about their kids? So this is the first drawing that my daughter brought home from preschool about 7 years ago. And I think you can see the hand scratch that says, Mom on it. And hell, it wasn't even for me, but I totally broke down. I thought this was awesome. I was like, oh my God, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. So I was like, well, I'm totally saving this. So I would go down in my basement, and I would put it in a bin, and before I realized, at the end of the year, I literally had 5 of these Rubbermaid bins. I was like, damn it, that thing was awesome, paper mache thing, I've got that down. And so I would just kept adding to all this, these materials that my daughter would produce because they were just beautiful, and I had such a connection to them. And what I realized, I was bored, I'm kind of, I'm a new dad, so I'm not doing much on Friday nights, and so I was like, all right, so let me think about this. 5 bins after the first year, right? 35 gallons in each one of those bins. Kid's gonna be around until they're 18. Hopefully they get out of the house, go to school or something. Oh, yeah, and then we had our second kid. So, what does that mean? So I was like, all right, so, 5,200 gallons of achievement. Obviously, I don't know if liquid measure is a way to quantify, qualify achievement. I was an English major, but I went with it. And it was, quickly went from, one of these moments where I was just like, oh my God, this is so cute, to Jesus Christ, what am I gonna do? Right? I was, and I think that what this helps to articulate and helps show is that this is unsustainable. This is an unsustainable model for our own lives, right? So if that model is unsustainable for our own lives, then how does that translate into the work that we do? And we kind of are doing the same thing. And so when we look at, really our own content behaviors, there's really kind of 2 main parts of our content behaviors. We have the physical interaction with that. And this is digital or tactical content that you can feel, hold, and touch, right? So you have the physical interaction. How much am I producing the content, moving the content around, organizing the content? And then there's our emotional dependence to any content that we work with. Did we write it? Did someone we love write it? Did someone we love produce it? Did somebody that we despise create that content. And all these factors combined really influence who we are as individuals and how we serve the organizations that we work for and with every day. So, as I often do with a lot of these kind of like mini social experiments that I like to produce in my head, I broke this down on a persona basis. Because I was like, I really feel like there are different folks who basically represent the different ways in which we work with content. So when we look at like what I call the 4 personas of content management, we've got, essentially the minimalist, right? This is like, walk into their home and it's like the white glove test. They've got nothing, like no tchotchkes, like it's literally like a stark white table, a black cabinet, and you don't know where the hell the food or the clothes are or the children, right? So there's the minimalist, and they produce, maybe receive content, and then it's quickly parsed out and out of the way. You don't really deal with it. Then you've got the curator. And the curator I love. Like the curator is somebody who you go to their house and their magazines are all neatly fanned out on the coffee table, and maybe they've got a selected piece of their child's artwork, maybe not 5 GD bins stored in the basement, but they're will manage the content in a very responsible way. Then we've got the stowaway. The stowaway might be my favorite because this person so desperately wants to be the curator. They're that person, right? Who, maybe they get their mail, they open their mail, they put it back in the envelope. Those people, if you are one of those people, I do not judge, but how you put it back in the envelope after it's been opened, really? But these are the people who, may have the magazines fanned out and picture of the kids' artwork, but they're the people who, when you go to their house for a house party and you go to open that 3rd bedroom door to like throw the coat in, and you're like, oh. Okay, all right, this all adds up, because it's just like, parse everything into this, 3rd bedroom, no one will see it, we won't deal with it, maybe every 6, 12 months, we'll clean it out, no big deal, right? And then we've got the post-it warrior who gives 0 Fs, right? Like, they are the person who, you go to their cubicle and it's just like everywhere. It's just, that's how they self-organize. God love them. But that's the way that they deal with content, and they're okay with chaos, and they're okay with clutter. And I think one of the things that this exercise shows you, and by breaking it down in those 4 quadrants, shows you is that, we're definitely dealing with and trying to figure out how we as individuals deal with content. How do we collect content? How do we deal with it? How do we deal with our information? How do we store our own personal information? Because it's going to affect the work that we're doing with our companies. And there's other factors that play into it. It's not so much just our physical, emotional, or emotional dependence on this content, but it's other things. It's things like tangible ability to enjoy space. As individuals, we have nearly doubled, my math sucks, but we've nearly doubled, the amount of square footage inside our daily homes, and it's because we just love space. When we buy a new laptop, we want to make how much space does it have? Can it fit all my stuff? When we get a new phone, same conversation. And so, what we're starting to see is just that we have this, we tend to fetishize the ability to have space so that we can store all our stuff, so we can store all those bins. And I think what's really interesting about this is a little bit dated, and it goes back like 6 years, and you start to see this dip. And this dip kind of helps disprove my point, so which I didn't want to point it out, but here I am. But you look at things like the tiny house movement, which, if you watch HGTV, it's on every 5 minutes, and you've got folks that are dealing with, they're downsizing, right? They're downsizing in their own lives. And I'd be very interested to see how that methodology and that mindset will translate into digital. I think that's something that we need to track moving forward as professionals. So, what about this digital content? When we look at how, we deal with the manifestation of this content. And Amber Case gave a great talk a couple years ago where she actually used a slide. I totally stole it. And this was basically a social experiment by the hard drive company Maxtor, in which they printed out somebody's all the pictures from their laptop for 8 years. And so this is physically what it looks like, right? And then, you come back and like, all right, if I had to like live with all that content in my own house, what would that look like? And it really shows you the cognitive disconnect that we have with, basically this device that we carry around in our hand every day and how much information and how much content is stored in it that literally is the size of our doorknob. But again, we love our space, but with this small little phone that we're not going to trip over, we don't think about it. And so it's out of sight, out of mind. So, one of the key takeaways from this part of the talk is that, your personal habits will affect your organization. So, and if when we talk about that, and we dig a little bit deeper and we try to unpack that, what do behaviors mean? And how do our digital behaviors, how are they manifested? And you really can't talk about behavioral science without bringing up the work of B.J. Fogg, who is a human behaviorist. And this is actually, I take great pictures. You can always tell when it's a picture that I took because it looks like crap. But this was a Post-it note from a talk that he gave a number of years ago, in which he was working with us on the concept of starting small. And if you're going to try to affect organizational change, or if you're just going to try to disrupt in any way the traditional mindset of your organizations, you need to start with that one tooth. And if you look at it as I need to floss every single tooth every single day, then that's basically leading to failure. And the way that he was able to articulate that is what you have was what's called the Fogg behavioral model. A lot of folks have interpreted his model and actually really like Bernhard Kopp's version of this. And the kind of the two main parts of this from the XY axis, if you're looking at your target behavior up in the upper right-hand corner, there's four major factors. You've got your high motivation, your low motivation, your high ability, and your low ability. And what does that mean, and how is that played out? So one of the organizations or one of the companies that I think it's really become kind of the gold standard of like how behavioral design and how human behavior is affected by content is Gopro, right? And so Gopro is just amazing. This is a company that back in 2002, $500 million company, and 3 years ago was up to almost like a $1.4 billion company. They're massive. And how does Gopro make their money? There's a huge marketing arm, right? And they produce equipment that people use every day, but they make money from you. You're their marketing arm. You're their sales division. You're their distribution team. Every single day, you're producing content on behalf of them. And so, 3 years ago, you have nearly 3 years of video that runs currently on YouTube. And this is just with the title GoPro in the title. There's so much content, and that's physical content that's being uploaded. And so it's a non-sustainable model. And so I want to unpack a little bit how we get there and what that means. So, I love this shot. This guy's got a great look on his face. But how did we get there, right? So we've got the gentleman over here to the left. And so I'm interested in the person that took that shot. That person basically, you're looking at, maybe it was his friend or girlfriend or something like that. She gets back to her apartment or house. She takes out her GoPro, plugs it in. She's already worked with the software. She's downloaded it. She's able to edit a clip relatively quickly. Then she's able to upload it, and then quickly she texts that photo to her friends, right? So she's highly motivated because she's just literally off of a high from jumping out of a plane. And then she's got high ability because she's very accustomed to using the software. And so basically she's able to get to that target behavior. She's able to get that shot because she's operating on both of those X and Y axes. As much as I'm interested in her shot, I'm interested in his shot. So what did his look like, right? And so the reality is that most likely this guy didn't get a great shot. Maybe this is the first GoPro he's owned. He comes back to his apartment. Maybe he was hungover from the night before, so he's got a little pizza stain on the lens of his GoPro. Tries to work with the software. Starting to get a little frustrated, trying to download it, and all of a sudden he gets a text from his friend that has this great photo of him. He's gone. He walks away from his computer, and now he's completely abandoned that content. There's low motivation, low ability to really carry out any action on that content. So again, it's just abandoned. So if we look at this again from our own individuals spheres, we do the same thing in the business world every day. And so this is a problem. This is a business who is centered around producing content, who says, and I quote, "Content management is very much a pain point for consumers as video storage is intensive, and figuring out how to produce polished, shareable content from hours of footage can be trying." Man, that's true. That's Gopro. They understand how much of an issue this is, and this is their core business model, and they still realize that this is a problem. So what this speaks to is really this abandonment issue that is creating duplicate, numerous pieces of content assets that now we have to wade through whenever we're designing our systems moving forward. And so, when we look at and we start to ask ourselves, why do we abandon content? We abandon content, we have time. This is something that's not built into our project schedule to go back and to curate all the legacy files or the 1.1 release of the PowerPoint that we were scheduled to work on, and now it's 5.0, and so it's really not built into our ecosystem. And then we have a low motivation. There's really no reason to do it. I'm not going to get a raise because I simplified my directory structure. Then there's accountability. And again, if you come back from a governance standpoint, there's really nobody, oftentimes, in a review, it doesn't come back as like, well, Jim, performance has been off the radar here, but geez, have you looked at your file structure lately? It's a mess. So it's really not built in inherently to the way in which we conduct business. So you can see how we would abandon content rather easily. So again, talking about the organizations, so we talked a little bit about the people, and my water go. I think Corey just stole my water. Blame Corey. Hashtag blame Corey. So let's talk about the organizational behaviors a little bit and how that plays into what we work on day to day. So I think it's important to realize that there's 4 main areas that organizations are dealing with content. It's one of those things where if you're a manufacturing company and you need to figure out how maybe you produce widgets and what does that mean for your business. So you need a data sheet on widgets. So you write up a data sheet on widgets, you post it to your website, and you have to deal with it. It's very means to an end. And I think the last part of this and the way that organizations approach content is that, they're still trying to figure it out. 15, 20 years ago, it was like, yay, we have a website. And then for the last 15 to 20 years, it's all about, oh, thank you. It's all about how you can, just throw as much content up on their website. And so we've created these giant repositories that's led us into the issue that we're in. But, it's why did we get there? And the reason why we got there is, for the most part, it's this last point. Organizations, unless you're a BuzzFeed or a GoPro or a news organization, it's not built into your inherent business model to be in the content business. You're just not in the content business, but you have to now deal with it because of the proliferation of digital moving forward. Dramatic pause. So, if we're going to talk about organizational behavior, we need to talk about organizational culture, which is definitely looking at the micro and the macro aspects. What are ways in which offices, people, communities, the locations that they serve, the occupations that those people in those offices are dealing with, how does that play into the work that we do? And the way which I'm able to kind of crystallize or to contextualize this information is a project that I worked on a couple years ago, which was for a medical device company. I was able to work with a bunch of massively talented designers and interaction experts, and we were on the hook for creating a digital kiosk to be built out in an operating room setting. And so what we needed to do was to basically create this wonderful digital experience. We had a series of design workshops and sketch sessions in which we worked through, and we started basically move towards this really, really elegant design. And then, me as the content nerd is raising their hand being like, all right, well, what are we doing with the content? Because right now we're designing this very elegant system. And the organization and their behavior towards content was so funny, and it had such a narrow focus that they were like, all right, well, listen, we've got all these assets. We have got more content about our medical devices than we know what to do with. So we are going to take that content, and this is actually an example. They said, Grocki, just take the data sheets that we have and all the product spec sheets. This is an example. I had to redact it, and I'll blow it up a little bit so you can see it. But they said, Grocki, use this content. It'll be perfect. We'll just port it over into the new experience, and there won't be a problem. Now, this data sheet, may be a little bit hard to read in the back row, but it talks about things like revolutionary issues and cutting edge technology and really ways in which you would really, really want to use this. By the way, this is like a stapler for like stapling up a body, like after it's been like that, like literally like that's what this is. And so this is the content that they wanted to use in an operating room setting where, again, they're trying, a nurse or a doctor or a practitioner would be trying to rush to this kiosk, dial in information about the stapler in order to fix the stapler during an operation. And so when I started to like parse through, and I actually showed them this slide, like, hi, like, and I'm always the sad trombone, right? As a content donk, you're always the sad trombone, right? You're just like, okay, like, hi, I know everyone's excited about this really pretty thing, but what the heck about the content, because it's kind of a mess. And so I showed them the slide. I'm like, really, all this stuff right here, like, nobody cares about that in an OR. And in fact, it's getting in the way. And maybe this is really what some of the information from this page that we can use, which is, one-handed grasping, curved tip reloads, enhanced visualization. I said, but the issue is we're creating this digital experience and this really elegant, beautiful thing that's going to be able to help doctors and literally could become, the issue between someone getting great care and mediocre care or, God forbid, like not good care. It doesn't answer this fundamental question, which is what happens if it breaks, which is exactly why they were designing this system in the first place. They were designing this digital kiosk because, I don't know if you know this, and I was pretty horrified when I found out, that anybody who, in an operating room, in the majority of operating rooms in America today, there is a sales representative who is also scrubbed in, just like a doctor or a nurse, who is there to answer any questions in case any of the equipment breaks. Like, that's their job. And so not only are they like telling you if something breaks, but they're also trying to like upsell you. Like, doctors are getting upsold on medical devices. So, tangent, sorry. But like, so, what you see here is that this organization, when they were looking to figure out how to deal with a digital problem and and they had a solution, they were missing one glaring aspect, which was the importance of the content within that design. And what we ended up having to do was kind of pause on the design aspect of it and then move right ahead and get them caught up on the content, reposition their content, restructure their content so that it would fit this model. And it ended up being a successful project, but it definitely delayed things because they were just going to shoehorn it in. And the reason that they were going to shoehorn that content in is because their organizational dynamic, the way that they behaved as an organization, was completely sales focused. We just want to get folks to buy these staplers so that we make more money. And I get it. And obviously you don't do that, you're out of business. But what I really like about my colleague Hilary Marsh's quote here is that essentially you have organizations that are so consumed with moving forward that very rarely will they take the time to look back and say, oh, right, okay, now I get it. And so it takes those projects that we work on for them to realize that this content thing that they've been ignoring for a while is going to become a major issue, which is why as like content advocates, and I really hope that everyone in the room today is a content advocate, you have that ability to raise your hand, to not wait till you get to that 11th hour, as Karen McGrain calls it, to raise your hand and say like, oh, we've got an issue, we need to deal with that. So, when we look at, ways that we're able to organize our back-end content, again, three, relatively simple principles, which is getting the right people on the bus. There's, process driving the tools, and then reducing net new content. And so what do we mean by that? So when we look at, getting the right people on the bus, tons of business books have been built around this model as far as in an organization getting the right people on the bus, but it's not so much about getting the right people on the bus as it is figuring out who is on the bus, who is on your team. So when you start to think about all the folks that are tasked with creating this digital experience, we often think of roles: user experience expert, researcher, designer, content person, project manager. But what are their personas and how are they dealing with content themselves? If we think back to that quadrant, you can have the most amazing writer, but if they're a stoic, or if they're a minimalist and they're trying to work with the post-it warrior, all of a sudden you have a people problem and an organizational problem, and it's not so much about just eliminating that dynamic, it's just being about cognizantly aware of these folks and positioning them well to help work with you on it. Like, if I have a content writing team, I know that my minimalist, oh man, is that person going to be the perfect person to make sure that we archive our data effectively, and it's keeping us on task with making sure that we're creating this simplified content ecosystem. So it's just about the personal dynamics and being able to get them to match correctly. And then we've got, process driving tools, right? Or tools driving process, which happens all the time. We've got the great CMS, let's just have the great CMS do everything that we need and we're all set. But they've never answered that fundamental question. So it's again, it's so great to say, all right, well, we have everyone on the same page, but everyone in the marketing department's on the same page, but everyone in the sales department is using this completely different tool. And so that you have this fractured process. So people ask me all the time, all right, well, from a writing standpoint, what's the best way in which you can, what is the best tool that people can use? And my answer to that is always the best tool that you use is the one that everyone's using together. So I don't care if you use Google Docs. I don't care if you use Microsoft Word or an Adobe product. I just all want you to be using the same product. It's easier said than done, but if you err on the sense of simplicity and you show the organization what can happen down the road if you're working in a fractured tool environment, then you can start to attract and show the kind of like dollars and cents that's creating the issue. And then we have this, false importance of net new content. The problem is, organizations have gotten very good at producing content. They love to produce content. And, we've got tons of organizations. I think right now it's really easy to pick on HubSpot. They're a little down, kind of a bad week for them. But they're in the business of producing content. And one of the things to keep in mind is that if you don't have a content strategy and you're not maximizing the efficiency of the content that you're producing, then you're creating a depreciating asset. And you're managing and you're working with a depreciating asset. And it's only a matter of time before the organization realizes where the pain point is. And you don't want to be on the end of that stick when that happens and when they realize that, because again, it devalues the work that we do. So again, what are ways in which we can simplify? So when we look at folks that are doing it correctly, that are doing it right, who are those folks and what do they look like? I love the work of the Mayo Clinic. I think a lot of folks in this room probably are aware of the content that they provide themselves, but that they also provide for hospitals, embedded content in some of today's best hospital systems. They're a great organization. And I was able to talk to them about this problem and this process that they worked with, because I'm like, you guys are the gold standard. You guys are totally doing this right. And they're like, well, time out, hold on, let me talk to you about this a little bit. So a couple years ago, they had over 750,000 content assets. It's like physical pages of content that they had to deal with. They had nearly 7,000 writers, folks that were producing this content, and then they had nearly 2,400 websites that they had to deal with and manage. This is all, by the way, all these numbers are for their internal customer. This is for your doctors, your clinicians, your physicians, your nurses. And so this is just content for the back of the house, if you will. And so, basically what they got really good at was creating a website, was just creating these multiple versions of websites, and they had really no procedures in place to figure out, to make it stop. It just kept growing and growing and growing. And so, they were able to stem this tide, and it took years. It wasn't easy, but the way that they were able to do this was they were able to produce defined content policies. And policies are not exceptionally easy things to talk about, and they're not, what people really want to bring up with on a status meeting, but they wrote it down. They created an archive that was very important to them. Then they also dealt with, and they actively curated over 45 individual personas. They created this persona library. Now, this is at scale, right? Especially if we're talking about like hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million pages worth of content. But it was very necessary for them to create this persona library so that they could defend every piece of content that was created, or the reason to basically reduce any piece of content, because it had to match against the goals and the objectives of each one of these personas. Now, for my work, and I work for some pretty large enterprises and some small businesses as well, I usually do like 3 to 5 personas. That's all I can handle. But again, they were able to do this because the organization had committed to having a team of folks that did this. This is a team that was literally, well, not those 2 statues in the middle. I think I looked at this picture for like a good hour before I was like, oh, wait a minute. They're kind of like pumping up their numbers a little bit. But, excuse me. So the organization committed to doing that, and I think that they were essentially able to reduce the number of pages by about 70%. So they were able to do that. And it really shows you that there are organizations that are out there, and they're few and far between, because again, we're still new at this. We're still trying to learn. And it's through that learning we really have to reach out to some of the organizations that are doing it well. And so when you look at, some of the organizations that are doing it well, sometimes it's forced. I know a lot of the work that Blend does, and some of the organizations and the agencies that I work with are working with clients that actively have to re-platform. They're actively, moving from one CMS to another CMS, or from a non-existent CMS to one CMS, or they're updating the design of their digital properties. And that really is and has become a wedge to say, okay, time out. All right, we're on the hook to create this new website. We've got 12 months to do it. We're re-platforming. I'm seeing 20,000 pages of content. And if we have to port over 20,000 pages of content, that's blowing out our timeline and our money. And so if you can go back to the business, and I recently just did this with a hospital system, where I was able to articulate how much it would cost and the time associated with porting over each individual page into the new CMS. And I think it equated to, they had 12 months. It would take us 3.5 years and something around $500,000 to do that. And they're like, oh, okay. Can you go create those persona things that we talked about and get it down to 1,000? And we did. And it was for a hospital system, and they're better served for it because they don't have to sift through all that content. So to kind of round out the talk today, I've only got a couple more minutes and a couple more slides, so thanks for bearing with me. But what can you do? Let's bring it back to you guys a little bit, right? And when you look at how you're working with your organization, there's kind of two main components to this. There's the high-level strategic thinking, and then there's brass tacks, how do I get this done? So, push for policy. I mentioned policy before, and Lisa Welshman has a great quote in which she talks about. And Lisa Welshman, if you're not familiar with her work, she does tremendous work on digital governance, and I would definitely recommend you checking out her work because some of her insights are really showing you and showing these organizations how they actually can to simplify some of the systems that they have in place. And what she says is that, what did she say? Statements? Jesus, Grocki, look at your notes. She says that policies are boring and standards are debatable. I'll say that again. Policies are boring and standards are debatable. And we see this all the time. In fact, last night when we were out at the speaker dinner, we had a good 20-minute discussion about capitalization of internet, email hyphen. And it was a lively discussion. We started to get down to the serial comma discussion, and I think someone kind of brought us back because it really got a little heated for a moment. I think Ron was ready to throw down. So when we talk about policy and when you talk about standards, don't allow yourself to at least just write down something and be like, this is our policy on content. Our policy on content is, these are the owners, this is how long, this is the shelf life of the content, this is what it needs to do, these are the goals. And at least you don't get mired into a debate about whether you should have this type of editorial standard versus that type of editorial standard. Those are good conversations to have with your writers, often in the writer's room, and they can debate and iterate on that, and they can really make a good case. But when you talk about policy, it's just good to get it written down on paper because, again, you've had that line in the sand, and that folks have something that they can work off of and react to. So that's kind of on the high-level side. On the tactical side, I always talk about what are ways in which we can do that. And so what I often do with the recommendations that I give to my companies are, having that one-for-one. I associate a name for every piece of content that a lot of my digital systems that I work with have. And what I mean by that is not necessarily getting the person that wrote it and putting their name next to it on a spreadsheet, but it's saying you, project manager, are responsible for these 5 pieces of content. Now that can mean anything from you need to review it to if somebody has a question about it, you need to ask it, but it's applying that ownership, and it's that one-for-one model that makes people accountable. If you look back to that slide that I had as far as saying why do we abandon it, it's because we're not accountable. So you're holding people accountable. A one-to-one model works great in order to facilitate that. This concept of governance, I mentioned it with Lisa's work as well, and what does governance mean? It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For writers and for folks that are working on digital projects, what I'll often do is I'll bring folks in and I will pit different either writing groups or UX groups against each other, and I'll say, well, what are you doing to simplify what we've got here? I know that we want to create a blog and we're going to write to that blog every week, which is a pipe dream, but like, okay, that's cute, and you can think that and you can do that, but like, what are we doing to simplify? And so I'll challenge each one of these groups when I sit in the room with the individuals. And I don't, it is very important to do this on a group basis and not an individual basis, because again, you want to make sure that the group is accountable. You want to make sure that folks are working together. And it's not a contentious meeting, but it's defending your work. And you're telling people not necessarily about what's net new, which we know about, but looking back, what are ways in which we're simplifying? Then the other part is the measurement part. The part about going back to the business, so that we don't have to deal with a business that is suddenly saying like, oh man, maybe we are dealing with a depreciating asset. Like, get in front of the story. The way to get in front of the story is to come to them, is to not wait until that next digital engagement and that big project or that big re-platform where you're suddenly tasked with creating this big content audit in order to simplify their experience, but you iterate on that and you get in front of them first. And don't be afraid to show them or to articulate to them any bad news. It's okay to come back to the business and say, hey, like, our numbers are down, and so our numbers are down on this part of the page, and the reason why they're down is X, and this is why I think we need to have Y amount of funds going over to X. We need a couple more writers in order to help this out, or folks can't get to what they need because we've got 40 links on this one page. And so I think there's this preponderance to think that we always have to come back to the business with like good news. Like, everything's great. Like, folks that run successful business are very good at dealing with pragmatic information that's able to articulate the real either problem or opportunity. And if you can propose one of those to them, then you're doing all right. And so in closing, and really what I want to get to you guys today is that ownership, governance, and measurement can help provide that motivation needed, right, for individuals and teams, and to help those organizations become more accountable for the content they create, triggering that reduced back-end clutter. So thank you very much. My name is Matthew Grocki. Does anyone have any questions? I mean, I totally know like food's on the other side of the wall. Oh, you have a question? Yeah.
Are these slides available anywhere?
Yes, they will all be available. I will post them personally on SlideShare, but I will make sure that we get those. Great. Oh, yes, sorry, the light's a little wonky, so yes. Well, I mean, yeah. Is this where I say it depends and I punch myself in the face? So it's one of the things I'm still working with this is introducing my own personal bias on how they should structure it. Depending on the organizational maturity, I will implore my own recommendations, and what I mean by that is that if I want to play nice in their sandbox. If they're a company that they're like this, if you have an image name, this is how you need to name that image name. If they're at that granular level, then I want to know what they're doing. They're probably doing some things right, and it's just about turning the screws. But as far as like it's very hierarchical. I mean, it's pretty standard. And honestly, like 2-second consultation, like create an archive directory. Who would have thought? Like, some of the really simple tips and tricks where you have folks rushing back and forth, and all of a sudden they go to a directory and there's 20 versions of the PowerPoint they need to work on. Just create an archive directory. Throw the rest of the stuff. You want that legacy information. You have to throw it away. That's fine. But just always have the latest and greatest that's right in front of everyone. Ooh, yay, yeah. Yes. The definition of a persona in general, or? Oh, our, drawing a blank, excuse me, content or digital behavioral personas, or content behavior persona, the 4 quadrants. Anyone? Let's go eat, guys. It's gonna be awesome.